June 9, 1944. Portland Harbor, Southern England, 5:40 a.m. The sea held flat, the color of iron. A low rain moved across the harbor, thin enough to be mistaken for mist. Lines of tankers waited under blackout discipline, hulls moored in silence, decks dark. Only the sound of pumps and chains broke the air. The fleet beyond the breakwater was still, rows of gray forms, sealed and waiting for the tide that would carry them to France. On the deck of HMS Rathmore, Diver Petty Officer Samuel Harker stood by the rail, helmet under his arm. His suit was damp with spray, heavy at the shoulders. He had been ordered to inspect the submerged fuel transfer lines, nothing more. The message had been read to him twice. Procedure was simple. Confirm the line, report, return. The smell of diesel clung to everything: cloth, rope, breath. The sea below moved in slow metallic folds. Somewhere beneath the hull, a valve had been sticking, interrupting the supply chain that fed the invasion ships. Engineers had traced it to a depth of 40 feet. Paperwork for a repair was still pending. A petty hum traveled through the hose as Harker tested the pressure. It was steady at first, then shifted. A faint tremor, wrong in pattern, not the usual pulse of fuel. It carried a vibration that seemed alive, as if a machine somewhere had found its own rhythm. The deck officer glanced at his watch. No one spoke. The rain ticked against metal fittings. Harker lowered his helmet, the glass already fogging with his breath. The tether line coiled once around the cleat. The sea slapped lightly against the ladder. "Inspection only," the officer repeated. Harker nodded. The phrase held finality, like the closing of a hatch. He descended slowly, each rung colder than the last. The world narrowed to hiss and static. Below, the surface vanished to pale smoke. At 20 feet, sound shifted. Pumps faded. Only the low resonance of steel and distant propellers remained. He followed the guide rope to the line itself, an armored pipe running like a spinal column beneath the waves. It was marked with chalk from the last repair, numbers half erased by current. He laid a hand on the valve. The vibration was stronger here, rhythmic, irregular. Not pump rhythm, not water pressure. Something caught within the mechanism. A piece, perhaps, vibrating free. Protocol required immediate ascent and report. But delay meant another hour lost for the fleet above. He hesitated, a micro-decision, unrecorded in any log. He unclipped his tool case. The tether twitched once in the current. The sea was calm, but pressure made it heavy, dense as machinery. He turned the first bolt, careful to keep the seal intact. The tremor intensified, then stopped. A pulse of trapped air escaped upward. Static filled his receiver. Then, nothing. By 6 a.m., he surfaced. Rain heavier now. The deck crew pulled him in. No one spoke. They watched the gauge climb back to pressure. The fuel began to flow again. Unbroken. No. Report was written beyond valve cleared. The paperwork held no deviation. By evening, the Rathmore was underway to rejoin the line. Harker cleaned his tools in silence, wiping each thread with cloth soaked in kerosene. Days later, the system fed an entire wing of the fleet without delay. No one mentioned the adjustment. No commendation was filed. When asked in debrief what he had done, Harker said only, "Check the connection." The officer nodded. That was enough. The system worked. The line stayed open through the landings. The fleet never ran dry. Years after, the record showed only the efficiency curve. No names, no minutes of decision, just the smooth continuation of flow. War remembers movement, not maintenance. The quiet kept the system alive. The town was built on steel and salt air. Every morning, gray clouds hung low over the cranes. Sparks from the yards flickered like dull stars against the wet concrete. Men there learned to measure by sound. The pitch of a rivet, the hum of a lathe, the tone of a turbine as it settled into balance. Samuel Harker grew in that rhythm. Before the war, he worked the calibration floor at Vickers, aligning turbine casings for ships that would never bear his name. His bench smelled of oil and graphite. He kept a rag folded once, always in the same pocket. Lunches were eaten standing, hands still marked with metal dust. He smoked 3 times a day, morning break, noon, and after clock out. Each cigarette timed to habit. 10 drags, counted unconsciously, like seconds on a gauge. Routine built a man's edge, he said once, though he rarely spoke of himself. His wife, Ellen, remembered how he listened to machines, the way others read a book or a prayer. He could hear imbalance before it showed. Once, when a compressor jammed in the mill, Harker shut down the line without waiting for orders. A small decision, but one that saved the rotor from tearing itself apart. The foreman said nothing, just nodded, and the shift went on. He trusted systems, the rules, the manuals, the steady ticking of procedure, but not to the point of blindness. He understood that systems breathed through the men who served them. Precision needed judgment. Metal needed listening. By 1939, when the war began, Harker was already fluent in pressure and tolerance. He joined the Navy's diving division, not for adventure, but for structure. He liked the machines, the suits, the exacting nature of depth. Underwater, the world reduced itself to function. Every hiss, every turn of a valve carried purpose. There was no noise, only the language of compression and flow. He cleaned his helmet glass before every descent, circular motions, slow and even. It wasn't habit. It was order, imposed on chaos. The diving rig became his small cathedral. Copper, hoses, bolts, clamps, a breathing loop that hummed like distant machinery. When sealed inside, he felt removed from the surface confusion. Only pressure and time existed. He didn't seek danger. He avoided talk. His crew knew him as steady, exact, the type who could rebuild a pump by sound alone. But beneath that calm was something else, a quiet defiance born from years of small choices no one recorded. When the gauge flickered, when a pipe sang off-key, he trusted his ear more than regulation. That habit had kept him alive before. It would define him again. By the time he reached HMS Rathmore, the invasion was already moving. Convoys, fuel lines, schedules, all tied together by precision. One valve jammed, and the system slowed. He stood on deck that morning, hands blackened from tightening the dive clamps. No one gave him new orders. The paperwork was still moving through channels, stamped and re-stamped somewhere far behind the front. The sea waited. The line below still vibrated with that uneven hum. Harker looked toward the horizon, then back to the deck. A man, built for obedience, standing at the edge of a rule he might have to break. The fleet's fuel hung on silence. The decision was his alone. Under the weight of the helmet, he steadied his breath. The rig filled with the sound of his own heartbeat against the brass. The world narrowed again to motion and metal. A system cannot feel doubt, but men can. He checked his watch once, then lowered himself into the sea. Would you have trusted the manual or your ear? HMS Rathmore, Portland Harbor, 6:10 a.m. The Rathmore was only one vessel in a system too large to see. From the docks at Falmouth to the gray waters off Cherbourg, a chain of ships moved in patterns mapped months before. Tankers fed destroyers. Destroyers screened convoys. Convoys carried the oil and ammunition that turned the invasion from plan to movement. Each link depended on the next. The system breathed through hoses, valves, and gauges. It was not a single machine, but a body of them, each alive with pressure and noise. The sound was constant, the low draw of suction pumps, the ticking of heat valves, the scrape of boot soles across steel. Delays were measured not in hours, but in consequences. One jammed valve could stall an entire line offshore. Thousands of tons of fuel could sit waiting, engines idling against the tide, men watching dials that no longer matched their charts. Somewhere behind it all, the pressure meters kept their steady pulse. By 6:10 a.m., that pulse began to change. The engineers on deck blamed weather drift, a slight rise in temperature, perhaps. The sea had thickened with rain and sediment. Readings were off by a fraction, they said, nothing critical. The lines hissed and settled again. Below, in the diver's log, a single note appeared in Harker's handwriting. Irregular feed rate, no elaboration. Just 3 words, written flatly, as procedure required. In the machinery compartment, the men moved with deliberate order. The war was full of systems like this, layers of movement guided by schedules and trust. Pumps were checked by touch, not sight. Every man had a task, every action a time. The flow of labor felt as measured as the fuel itself. Yet somewhere under the hull, the pressure was wrong. The vibration Harker had felt earlier was growing into rhythm, not violent, not yet, but insistent, like something breathing too fast. The feed line, invisible beneath the surface, was building resistance. The sound barely carried through the deck plates, but the divers would have recognized it. The officers above did not. They followed the dials. Fuel still flowed. The records stayed clean. The system trusted its own design. It always had. Elsewhere, tankers waited for signal clearance. Engines ticked low, conserving power. The convoy schedule left no room for improvisation. When the first ships moved, the rest would follow in order, a tide of steel depending on invisible maintenance. The sea between them and the enemy coast looked empty, but it was thick with movement. Lines, frequencies, and code. Every minute of flow mattered. Every error echoed outward. The Rathmore's deck crew watched the hoses flex under load. Warm vapor leaked from a joint and drifted away into fog. No one mentioned it. Too small to delay the schedule, too familiar to alarm. By 6:20 a.m. the gauges steadied. The noise returned to normal. Men returned to coffee and ledgers. But in the forward line, a knot of trapped air compressed against the valve, silent, unseen. The system carried on, believing itself unbreakable. It had been built that way, redundant, self-correcting, strong enough to ignore the human margin. Yet every strength carried its weakness. The steel could only report what it was asked to measure. Down below, the hum persisted, deeper now, like a whisper through pipes. It was the sound of a body unaware of its wound. At the edge of the harbor, smoke from the fleet drifted inland. Trucks on shore lined up in precise intervals, loading drums for the next cycle. Logistics worked without hesitation, the great mechanical tide pushing forward toward France. No one looked back toward the Rathmore. No one saw the tremor that passed along the hose as the current shifted. In systems this large, warnings rarely sound like alarms. They sound like work continuing. Would you have heard the change or trusted the rhythm? June 9th, 1944. 6:40 a.m. condensation gathered along the brass dials in slow, uneven streaks. The gauges sweated like men under pressure. Lines of moisture dripped to the deck, collecting at the base of the fuel console. Each drop marked time more accurately than the clock above. The Rathmore held steady. Her hull creaked under its own weight, not from wind or tide, but from something within. A faint metallic rattle passed through the deck plates, a vibration so soft it disappeared when men spoke. It came again, steadier, then stopped. The sea beyond the rails remained calm, unnaturally calm. No swell, no wind. The silence pressed against every surface until the smallest sound, rope against cleat, valve turning, chain shifting, carried farther than it should. The air was heavy with diesel. Below the awning, Diver Petty Officer Samuel Harker waited beside the open ladder. Suit sealed, lines checked. His boots were wet from spray. Through the soles, he could feel the hum travel up from the ship's skin. Irregular, pulsing, alive. He signaled readiness. The deck officer nodded. Harker stepped forward and dropped. The water closed over him cleanly, like glass lowered onto metal. The surface vanished above in seconds, a pale film trembling in the light. Down here, the war changed texture. Every sound narrowed. Every vibration became language. At 40 feet, visibility was reduced to gray. The silt hung in the current like smoke. The supply pipe ran ahead of him, thick as a man's waist, bolted in sections that curved away into shadow. Each joint exhaled a slow thread of bubbles, the natural breath of compression. He moved along its length, hand over hand, counting bolts as he went. The rhythm steadied his breathing. Then he felt it, heat through the glove. Subtle, but real. One section of pipe was warmer than the rest. That shouldn't have been possible. He pressed his palm flat against the surface. Beneath the vibration of flow, there was another rhythm, uneven suction, faint but deliberate, as if pressure inside had found its own channel. He followed procedure. 2 taps on the metal. Anomaly. The reply from above came late. A single jerk on the line. Uncertain. He stayed still. The water pressed against him, weightless but absolute. Through the helmet receiver, the steady hum of the pump filled his ears. It was constant, mechanical, and then something else joined it. A hiss. Long, narrow, sharp. It did not belong to air. He turned his head toward the sound. Tiny white threads of gas bled from the joint ahead, curling upward into the dark. They vanished before reaching light. He unclipped his slate, the pencil tethered to his wrist. The graphite scratched across the surface. Request stop flow. He waited for the rope signal. 3 quick tugs for acknowledgement. Nothing. He waited longer. The pump's rhythm deepened, pressure feeding forward. Then the reply came. 1 slow pull. Continue. Orders were clear. The system was still running. He lingered, one hand on the line, the other resting on the valve housing. The warmth beneath his glove increased slightly, then steadied again. Above, the pumps roared harder, feeding ships that waited beyond the breakwater. He looked at the bubbles rising from the seam. They came faster now, finer. He imagined the fuel surging past, tons of it each minute, pressing against the weakness he could feel but not see. The system had made its choice. Harker exhaled once, small and controlled. He tapped the pipe again, more out of habit than hope. Then he waited, listening to the static that filled the sea. No more signals came. He checked his gauge, steadied his breathing, and began tracing the joint again. The vibration answered him like a pulse, steady and indifferent. Up above, the dials gleamed through condensation. The crew logged another hour of continuous feed. Below, Harker stayed motionless. One man suspended inside the body of a machine that refused to stop. The war's lifeline was still flowing. The fault was still alive. The sea held its breath. The fog thickened, and the light above turned pale, diffused through layers of suspended silt. Below, the Rathmore's diver remained fixed in the suspension between duty and instinct. Samuel Harker floated at depth, steady against the slow pull of the hose line. The coupling before him shuddered faintly. Through his glove, the tremor felt like an animal's pulse. He checked his gauge. Depth, 42 feet, pressure stable. Flow rate, irregular. The manual said to observe only. Record, report, return. Distance was safety, interference, a breach. Yet Harker had worked enough machinery to know what stress sounded like. the same tight hum, the same rising warmth before failure. A vibration that climbs instead of steadies. He reached toward the joint again. The metal was hot to the touch. Not burning, but unnatural for sea depth. A sure sign of friction, or worse, compression. The manual didn't mention warmth. Above, the Rathmore's deck remained still. Men checked dials, timed readings, filled columns. To them, the system looked sound. Pressure within acceptable limits. But the sea absorbed subtler noises, the kind only one man could hear through layers of brass and water. Harker adjusted his tether. The coupling groaned softly, a sound low and round, like a slow breath through iron lungs. He recalled Barrow, the turbine room, the smell of coolant on steel. The same pattern, the same warning before a housing split. He'd stopped the machine that day, without clearance. The foreman said he'd been lucky, but luck had nothing to do with it. Metal spoke its own dialect. Here, it spoke again. He wrote on his slate, feed unstable, pressure spike. Then below it, possible fracture forming. He tugged the signal rope once, twice, then 3 times, urgent. No reply. The line remained slack. He waited, counted. 5 seconds, then 10. Still nothing. Somewhere above, someone was deciding how many forms it would take to halt a pipeline, how many minutes it could afford. The system ran by numbers, not by sound. The vibration deepened. The coupling ticked, a sharp, brief chime. Not loud, but precise, like a cracked bell. He pressed closer, defying protocol. His helmet light caught faint ripples in the metal. Stress patterns, invisible to most eyes, but to a mechanic's trained one, as plain as breath on glass. He rested a gloved hand there. Beneath it, a hollow thump repeated in intervals of 5 seconds, then 4, then none. Silence. The pipe went still. Then, one long exhale, a vacuum forming. Fuel was no longer moving forward. It was being pulled backward into its own cavity. One spark, one trace of heat, from friction, and the system would ignite. The ship above would not survive it. Harker steadied his breath. He knew the order. Do not improvise underwater. The words echoed, deliberate, final. He looked at the coupling. The pipe flexed, almost imperceptibly, like a lung preparing to collapse. Another vibration, short, violent, then gone. He made a decision, not calculated, not defiant, simply made. He reached for his wrench. In that second, he was no longer following orders or breaking them. He was following arithmetic, pressure, time, tolerance, the language of machines. He turned the first bolt half a rotation counterclockwise. The vibration shifted, then faded. The joint steadied under his hand. The temperature cooled. He waited, watching the bubbles thin out until only the current moved. Up above, the deck gauges leveled back to normal. Engineers noted the reading, unaware that a diver below had made an unauthorized correction. Harker replaced his wrench, recorded one line on his slate. Line stabilized. Then he let the sea hold him still for a moment, as if listening to the quiet return of function. He tugged the rope once for retrieval. The system continued its pulse. The flow resumed. The war moved on. He surfaced 20 minutes later to a sky without change, flat, gray, and absolute. Procedure had been restored. No one would mention deviation. He handed in his slate. The officer nodded once. No questions asked. Under the calm, the valve held. Above it, silence stood for order. The hum of the system never stopped. It pressed through metal, through water, through the bones of the diver below. The pipeline stretched east, feeding engines, feeding ships, feeding war. To touch it without clearance was to touch the artery itself. Harker knew this. He also knew the sound it made now was wrong. At 40 feet, the current pushed soft against his shoulder. The coupling before him gave a faint tremor, steady but rising. The pressure gauge on his wrist glowed dim, its needle quivering in the red margin. He watched it twitch twice, then stop, then climb again. No signal came from the surface, no rope tug, no order. Procedure said, wait. He waited 6 seconds, then 7. The pipe gave another metallic sigh, deep, strained, followed by the hollow pop of air trapped under pressure. That was enough. He reached for the auxiliary feed line. The hose was slick with algae, its brass coupler worn smooth by years of use. His gloves moved slowly, feeling each groove, counting through the steps he had practiced only in training. This was not a sanctioned maneuver. It was a drill instruction meant for theory only, an airline knot, a crude bypass used to choke or redirect flow. Never employed under live conditions, the manual called it non-standard intervention. He called it necessity. He looped the hose around the feed joint once, twice, drawing it tight with measured tension. The knot resisted at first, flexing under load. Then it gave. The line constricted, hissing softly as internal pressure shifted course. The vibration stopped. The silence that followed was complete, dense in the water around him. Only his breathing remained. A slow intake, a slow release, the rhythm of machinery resetting itself. He checked the gauge. Needle steady. Flow consistent. It was done. He reached into his tool pouch, withdrew a short stick of chalk wrapped in wax cloth. With one slow stroke, he marked a white line along the joint, a diver's signature, unseen by most, meant for whoever might come after. The sea would wash it away within hours, but for now it was there. A small record of defiance written in calcium dust. He lingered a moment, scanning the joint. The current eased. The water cleared slightly, revealing the dull sheen of the metal returning to stillness. Above, the deck carried on. Men smoked near the vents. The chief engineer noted a pressure correction on the gauge and checked it off without comment. The log read stabilized. No one asked why. Harker began his ascent. The sound of his breath grew louder with each meter, steady, mechanical, like the pulse of a slow engine. The surface wavered above, a moving ceiling of gray light. At 7:26 a.m. he broke through. The air was cool, flat, without wind. The ship rolled once on a low swell, then settled. No alarm, no radio call, no reprimand. He climbed the ladder, unhooked his gear, and crossed the deck. His boots left thin trails of water across the steel plates. The men nearby didn't look up. He handed his slate to the duty officer. One note written, "Minor adjustment." The officer signed, unread. The entry disappeared into record, one line in a war of thousands. The sea below kept its rhythm, the knot held, the system continued. It did not care who tied it. It only cared that it ran. Would you have tied the knot, knowing no one would ever know you did? The sea remained still over the Rathmore. A faint haze lay low across the horizon, muffling distance. Engine blocks idled under low revolutions, their vibrations steady as a pulse. Then through the fog a sound arrived, dull, wide, without echo. It rolled under the water first, then through the hull. Men paused, heads turned toward the east. 40 miles away, the bracken field had broken. No flash was visible, only a bloom of gray rising in the distance, carried flat across the water. The report came 2 minutes later, through the radio net. A static burst, clipped and harsh, followed by silence. One of the operators adjusted the dial. The frequency whined, caught interference, then settled into a crackling drone. The air on deck changed, dense with listening. For 2 hours, no message followed, no confirmation, only short-wave murmur. The crew of the Rathmore continued their cycle. Gauges checked, valves cooled, flow rates recorded, but their rhythm slowed. The routine, still mechanical, carried a quiet undertone of waiting. At 9:11 a.m., a coded message arrived. The E.D. Brackenfield's line had ruptured during fueling. Same model valve, same pipeline pattern, identical feed assembly. The backflow pressure had reversed too fast for relief systems to vent it. The result was immediate. The ship and her cargo ignited on contact with air. Nothing of her deck crew survived. The Rathmore's men gathered near the main pump station. No one spoke. The pressure gauges before them stayed fixed, steady. The numbers held, unchanged since the previous hour. Someone murmured, "Could have been us." No one answered. Below deck, the log officer reviewed the morning's entries. 7:26 a.m. Minor adjustment. No other remarks. No notation of deviation. No record of interference. He hesitated for a moment, reading the line again. Then he turned the page. Regulations required only data, not conjecture. Outside, the sea remained calm. A slow line of black smoke traced the eastern horizon, faint and continuous, where the Brackenfield had burned. Harker stood by the railing, wetsuit half unzipped, drying in the weak light. He smoked 3 drags from a short cigarette, letting the paper burn down to the filter. His hands were still marked faintly with chalk dust, the residue from the bypass knot, now washed thin but not gone. No one had asked about it. No one would. The bypass held. The feed remained stable. The convoy's schedule continued without interruption. By noon, the Rathmore's tanks were 3/4 full, the line humming with unbroken flow. The war machine fed itself in rhythm again, measured, disciplined, exact. The system demanded only function, not memory. The Brackenfield's loss was filed into logistics summaries. Replacement fuel allocations were drafted before dusk. A note in the engineering circular would later mention a fault in Series 9 valve assemblies. The words operator error would appear beside it, followed by a recommendation for additional supervision on maintenance dives. The system absorbed its failure, corrected, continued. Harker watched the horizon fade under midday haze. The faint column of smoke dissolved into cloud. He flicked the last inch of his cigarette into the water and returned to work. His tools hung clean, lined precisely on the bench. The sound of the engine room resumed its rhythm, a low thrum, constant and exact. No one spoke of what didn't happen. No one noted who had prevented it. By 4:00 p.m., the deck log showed all systems nominal. The Rathmore steamed west to rejoin the convoy. The sea closed over everything. The war moved forward, indifferent, consuming steel and men alike with equal necessity. Only the machinery endured. Would you have tied the knot, knowing the system would never say your name? 2 days after the Brackenfield's destruction, the harbor moved under gray weather. The tide was slow, the cranes motionless, the steel of the dock sweating under a film of salt mist. Fuel drums stood in tight ranks, each marked in white stencil, waiting for reallocation. Inside the administration block, The air smelled of carbon paper and damp uniforms. Harker waited there. His dive gear had been turned in the previous night, each tool cleaned, logged, and returned to stores. He stood now before a panel of 3 officers. The inquiry began without ceremony. No preamble, no introductions. The minutes were already typed. The officer in the center, a commander by insignia, read from a narrow file. "Unauthorized intervention on live feed," he said. "Result, stabilization of flow. Deviation from operational protocol confirmed." His tone did not change between the violation and the outcome. The words were administrative, meant for record, not understanding. Harker said nothing. The questions that followed were brief. Time of the act, equipment used, depth, visibility. Each answer came short, factual. When the commander asked why he had acted without command authority, Harker's reply was quiet. "Because the medal said so." There was no response, only the scratching of a pen recording the statement. The inquiry closed at 10:37 a.m. The verdict, field deviation under operational stress, was stamped once, initialed twice, and filed into the binder marked Rathmore Incident, Routine Review. There would be no commendation, no reprimand. The record ended where the system required it to. Outside, the cranes resumed movement. Chains lifted, iron struck iron, and the harbor returned to its pattern. The Rathmore's bunkers were refueled by noon, her hoses tested clean. By 5 p.m., she cast lines and moved from berth, her engines turning over with a low metallic rhythm. The crew spoke little on deck. Orders were carried out with the same mechanical precision as before. The sound of fuel coursing through the lines was steady, the vibration familiar. In the mess that evening, the air was still. Tin cups clinked softly against metal tables. Someone mentioned the Brackenfield, then stopped. The name did not continue. Conversation drifted to weather, ration tins, watch schedules. The silence around the subject was practiced, efficient. By 8 p.m., only rumor remained. It passed quietly through the fleet, divers tying safety knots before fueling. Unofficial, unrecorded. No one cited instruction. No one asked permission. It became a routine, absorbed into habit like a reflex. Harker returned to maintenance duties the following day. He inspected gauges, checked seals, and signed logs that no longer carried his name as diver. His place in the record narrowed to initials, then disappeared. The Rathmore steamed on schedule. Her lines held. Her systems hummed in time with the fleets. In the weeks that followed, the war continued its arithmetic. Fuel in, fuel out, movement constant. The system erased anomalies as it always did. It fed on correction, on compliance, on the unbroken function of men and machines. Some said the sea remembers everything, but the files remember nothing. Harker's act dissolved between the two. The metal spoke once. He answered, then silence. Would you have heard it? By the early 1950s, the old fueling ships were gone. The Rathmore had been stripped at dock, her plates cut, her nameplate sold for scrap. New vessels came, longer, cleaner, more efficient. The manuals were rewritten, their language colder, stripped of the names that once filled margins with corrections. Buried deep in the revised edition of the Fleet Fueling Manual, Appendix C, page 47, a line appeared. Manual constriction may be used to offset anomalous feed vibration. No source, no citation, just procedure. The kind of phrase that blends into a sea of instructions, unnoticed, unquestioned, obeyed. Only a few who had served on the Rathmore knew what it meant. They recognized the phrasing. They knew the hands that had tied it first. but names fade faster than oil evaporates. Harker had retired by then. He lived on the northern edge of Barrow, in a small terrace near the docks. The air smelled of brine and old iron. He repaired bicycles for shipyard boys and dock workers, his fingers still carrying the stiffness of years underwater. The shed where he worked was lined with tin tools, hung with care, arranged like instruments of an older trade. In a tin box beneath the bench, he kept his diving log. The pages were soft from handling, corners darkened by oil and salt. He opened it sometimes without reason, checking the entries as though to ensure they still existed. The handwriting was cramped, mechanical. Beside June 9, 1944, the line read, "Minor adjustments to auxiliary feed. Pressure stable." No elaboration. No mark of what that adjustment meant. Outside, the shipyards echoed with pneumatic hammers and the distant whine of cranes. Industry had changed its tone, but the rhythm remained the same. The measured beat of maintenance, supply, repair. Systems built on silence, running best when no one noticed. You could still find the airline knot in practice. It was taught unofficially in diver training, passed down as a useful constriction loop. The instructors didn't name its origin. They didn't need to. It worked, and that was enough. The logic of survival, quiet, efficient, anonymous. There were no plaques for that kind of invention, no medals pinned for averting what never happened. The fleet moved forward. The system endured. Somewhere, between the ink of the manual and the rust of forgotten ships, the record flattened Harker's act into procedure. What had been instinct once was now a clause, a footnote, inside an instruction that no one questioned. He grew older. His tools wore smooth with use. The shed windows filmed over with sea dust. Each winter, the sound of wind off the channel rattled the tin roof, the same rhythm as water pulsing through hoses long ago. He never spoke of the Rathmore, never mentioned the Brackenfield. When asked if he missed the sea, he said, "The sea doesn't miss anyone." Industrial systems do not remember men. They remember efficiency. The war's machine, fed by countless unrecorded corrections, rolled on until it no longer needed the hands that steadied it. In the great archive of war, there are no margins for instinct, only clean lines of procedure. The airline knot remains there still, uncredited, intact, alive in the quiet turns of new divers' fingers. Some acts, too precise for monuments, survive in repetition alone. If the system forgets its guardians, does the sea remember?